Good afternoon. Can you all hear? Oh, great. You can definitely hear me. So let me amend that. I just got promoted to William's role. I'm actually Ryan Calkins from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I'm an advisor on offshore wind and maritime infrastructure, and I'm going to moderate a panel today. So I'm going to start with the introductions. I'm going to give you guys an update on the bios of our panelists here, and then we're going to go right into questions. I would encourage you, if you have questions for the panel, to use your conference app to add those. And if there is time at the end, we will get to those as well. So to my immediate left is Jocelyn Brown-Saracino. She's the offshore wind lead at the U.S. Department of Energy. She's been with the department for over 14 years and was instrumental to the establishment of the joint agency 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal, which we are going to all here collectively achieve. And she also leads the department's offshore wind strategy planning efforts, which helps lead the establishment of the new floating offshore wind shot, the initiation of the DOE and BOEM offshore wind transmission action plan, and contributes to the establishment and management of the White House-led federal and state offshore wind partnership, which is associated with the supply chain MOU. Next to her is Carrie Sessions. She's from the Office of the Governor of Washington State, and she serves as the Senior Policy Advisor for Environment and Water, where she works to protect human health and the environment in Washington State. Carrie leads Inslee's strategic agenda on a suite of environmental topics, including water quality and quantity, solid waste and recycling, toxics reduction, air quality, environmental justice, and offshore wind. And finally, William Lin, who is in fact the US program wind sector leader and Japan program leader for the Danish Energy Agency. He's been a part of the wind industry since 2008 and has broad insights to the global wind industry dynamics. Williams is currently with the Danish Energy Agency, where he oversees Denmark's climate and energy partnerships with Japan and the US with a focus on wind. So we're going to start out going from the international to the national to the state. And so with that, we're going to start with William. My question for you, William, is we certainly all in this room owe a debt of gratitude to Denmark for its half-century of leadership in wind energy. It also serves as a node serving multiple countries working together to achieve renewable energy goals. What lessons can we learn on the West Coast from the robust and integrated European offshore wind industry?
Thank you for that question, Ryan. It's a humbling experience sitting here representing a small country of 5.5 million people trying to give good advice to the world's most advanced economy, so sweaty palms here. So I just landed last night, so if I'm talking gibberish, then please just cut me out. I think what we're working off of today in Denmark and in Europe is really a foundation that was laid by some visionary politicians 30, 40 years back in time. So it's been a long journey for us up until today, really. And so what we're trying to achieve here in California, trying to expand offshore wind within the span of 10 years, it's really, really ambitious, and it's really kudos to that. I think if I should point out a few things that we've done well in Denmark that has worked for us is really three things. 20 years ago, EU had a directive of reforming the power market, where we really enabled the creation of a liberalized power market with dynamic pricing. We simply took the value chain and chopped it up and allowed more transparency, more flexibility in that entire system. And that has really been one of the foundational stones for the proliferation of renewable energy and for the uptake in the entire system. So that's one thing. And so it's really a matter of how do you reward an energy source that literally has zero marginal cost, number one. Number two, designing a market through really engaging with those players and figuring out how do you actually allocate and split the risk between the state and the industry. Finding a good way to do that. And in Denmark, we've had a very strong history of engaging and having these market dialogues, right? So when the government goes out and buys big projects, it essentially has three approaches. One is, I know what I want, give me a price. The second approach is, I know what I want, let's negotiate. And the third approach is, I kind of have an idea of what I want, but let's talk about what it could look like. So having different approaches where you engage with the industry, trying to figure out what's the risk appetite, what are you willing to take of risk as a government, and then on the basis of that, figuring out what's best split and the best approaches. That's number 2. The last one is really, do remember the people and the communities. What has worked very well for us and really increased the acceptance of renewables, in Denmark in particular, has been that we've had some mechanisms where we've required the project developers to sell a part of the equity stake in a project to the local communities. Let them buy in, let them get engaged, let them reap the benefits of that development as well. So I think those 3 things have really propelled the development of renewables in Denmark.
Excellent, thank you, William. Jocelyn, the federal government has really taken a whole of government approach to the audacious goals for offshore wind that I mentioned in your introduction. For this room in particular, as we talk about the Pacific Offshore Wind Summit, in which floating offshore wind is our technology, what are some of the federal initiatives that your office is supporting to help drive down the cost and to facilitate that goal of specifically 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And before I chime in, I just wanted to thank Offshore Wind California for the opportunity to be here today and the opportunity for those of you who had the fortitude to be here early this morning, the opportunity to start us off and then be part of this last conversation of the day. And some of what I'm going to speak to kind of has echoes of what I mentioned this morning. But before I talk about national initiatives and the work that we're doing at the national level, just want to recognize the important points that Will just made and acknowledge the fact that as we think about developing offshore wind in a national and a regional and state-based context, we are, of course, part of a global offshore wind ecosystem. And there's a huge amount that we can and should be doing with respect to learning and collaboration as we seek to develop offshore wind in the United States. And just want to mention that across the federal government, we are doing an immense amount of international collaboration. We're working directly with Denmark. We have a joint notice of intent out to support some forthcoming research. We have collaboration with Japan. We do a lot of work through the International Energy Agency. So just want to underscore the importance of international collaboration before diving into talking about some of the national initiatives. So this morning, I talked about the Floating Offshore Wind Shot, which is an initiative across the federal government, and it's co-led by the Departments of Energy, Commerce, Interior, and Transportation. And it's an effort to really combine our resources, our authorities, our expertise to really try to advance U.S. leadership in floating offshore wind and to advance the just and sustainable deployment of offshore wind. And we are working across what we call 5 pillars in the shot and have significant work going on in each of those areas. So one of our primary initiatives is to support R&D to continue to lower the cost of energy for floating offshore wind. I mentioned this morning that since the initiation of the shot about a year and a half ago, we've invested over $200 million in R&D to help reduce the cost of energy and innovate floating offshore wind systems, including some important programs like the Atlantis program out of our ARPA-E office, which works to promote systems engineering of floating offshore wind systems. The Flow-In Prize, which I had the privilege of announcing the phase 2 winners of this morning, which works at the intersection of supply chain development, supply chain needs, and technology development. We are working to support transmission, planning, and infrastructure development. We have an effort underway on the West Coast, both a multi-year analysis that's being led by Pacific Northwest National Lab in partnership with our National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a multi-year study looking at transmission potential on the West Coast from a regional perspective. And we're leading a series of convenings with key groups to really try to make sure that as we're thinking about what the future of transmission build out for offshore wind might look like on the West Coast, we're hearing from the community of stakeholders that have important input to provide there. We are also working to advance environmental science, social science research, and community engagement. And then do want to spend a few minutes talking about, as I think a focus of this panel is going to be supply chain development, talking about the programs and resources that we have both at DOE and then across the federal government to support supply chain development. So part of what we help support in the supply chain space is analysis and planning. So we helped support the development of a national offshore wind supply chain roadmap that had a floating component. We supported the development of a regional port study for the West Coast, looking at what port needs might look like as we look to build out to the future and how those needs might be met through a combination of developing, staging, and marshaling ports as well as O&M ports. We have a suite of resources to help support the development of supply chain. Those resources range from resources at the Department of Transportation to support port infrastructure development, to provide federal financing for vessels, as well as a federal loan guarantee program we have at the U.S. Department of Energy, the Loan Program Office, which has the ability to provide loan guarantees to a suite of different activities ranging from actual project development, transmission, to supply chain. And then the last thing I want to mention is that we have a suite of new policies to support supply chain development. And one that I want to mention here is the 48C manufacturing tax credits. The first round of selections under 48C were announced a few weeks ago, and that included $200 million in support for wind-related efforts ranging from support for cables, steel manufacturing, substations, and more. And I want to emphasize that in part because the Department of Energy, IRS, and Treasury have indicated that the next round of that funding is coming soon. So would flag that for folks who might be interested in trying to access those funds.
So you've just described exactly what William shared too, that dialogue between industry and government and figuring out which are the areas where government can most help to de-risk so that industry can come in and not have to price in a risk premium on their bids. Carrie, in our federal system, we preserve a lot of authority to the state level. And in the case of offshore wind, it means that this ensures that a lot of decisions are made with greater community engagement, that preservation of some measure of control remains at the local level, and it allows, in the best of cases, to address those local concerns immediately. Can you share how you and your office are balancing that approach with the national goals for implementation?
Great. Thank you, Ryan, and it is an honor and pleasure to be here, so thank you very much. I want to start with a little bit of context on where Washington State is with offshore wind. So there are 2 unsolicited lease requests that have been sent to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for facilities that are off of our coast. BOEM has not yet acted on those leases, and Washington has not set any goals or any formal stances on floating offshore wind generation off of our coast. Where we are right now is really exploring what a potential planning and evaluation process for offshore wind generation could look like for our state. And what we're really focusing on right now is that even though it is a BOEM and federal permitting process, we really believe that a process has to center on what is going to be best for Washingtonian and our residents. And that's not to say that it's insular only. What is best for Washingtonians, a large part, is a rapid move to decarbonizing our economy and looking at a suite of clean technologies and renewable energies that can help us get there. And so looking and exploring offshore wind is one potential in that full suite of policies. Looking at Washington, I think we have to be really cognizant to the unique things that are going on in our state. We have 29 federally recognized tribes that have treaty protected rights to resources. We have coastal communities that are really rural in nature that would potentially be impacted by offshore wind. We have really robust commercial recreational fishing. And so we have to make sure that all of these are really centered in a planning and evaluation process. And it is also our values, as it is in California, to really center science in any of our evaluations of clean energy and making sure that we are using science and science-based processes to drive decisions. And so all of that is informing how we are thinking about potentially engaging with our state and maybe with the federal government on how to evaluate and plan for offshore wind in our state. What I feel really fortunate about is that we have a lot of other models, both internationally and domestically, that we can learn from, and we're not recreating the wheel. And so one thing that we're doing is doing a deep dive on what experiences other states have had in planning and evaluation, where it's their state of scientific research, and what can we learn from all of these experiences. We're doing that both through deep dives with some consultant studies and then also through regional forums, such as the West Coast Ocean Alliance and the Pacific Coast Collaborative, to really make sure that we're gaining all of the lessons learned that we can from those that have gone before us.
Jocelyn, the Department of Energy and other federal departments have been facilitating collaboration among East Coast states in order to streamline offshore wind development. It's through something called the Federal States Implementation Partnership, the shortened version. Can you speak to progress there and whether similar efforts might be relevant for the West Coast?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that initiative, that's an initiative that was stood up by the White House a couple years ago now to try to bring together both the federal government and states involved in offshore wind development to try to work together to advance offshore wind in the United States. And that partnership started with East Coast states and then was expanded to include Louisiana and California just over a year ago. And as part of that partnership, about a year ago now, the states and the 4 federal agencies that are also partners on the shot, so Departments of Energy, Commerce, Interior, and Transportation, as well as numerous East Coast states, signed a memorandum of understanding to work together to address both national supply chain gaps for offshore wind, as well as regional supply chain gaps and needs for offshore wind. And as part of that, the states agreed to develop sub-regional partnership agreements. So functionally what that means is agreements between conglomerations of states along the Atlantic coast to work together to develop offshore wind supply chain. And those states are in the process of working to develop those plans right now. And then we are also working on a number of other efforts through that MOU. So one that I'll note is that we just a couple weeks ago published an integrated procurement, state procurement and federal leasing viewer for those East Coast states and for BOEM planned leasing efforts over the next 5 years, so that there's a tool that just provides some transparency as both developers, as the supply chain providers, and just interested citizens can look out to the future and understand both when there might be leasing opportunities and how that might be partnered with opportunities for offtake for that power. So that's some of what we've been working on with respect to the East Coast. We are in very early stages of conversations with our federal partners and with states on the West Coast about what something similar might look like on the West Coast. And in the meantime, one of the things that we've been doing at the Department of Energy is really trying to support regional analyses. So I mentioned, and efforts. So I mentioned previously our regional transmission planning effort and our regional ports analysis. So hopefully that helps provide some groundwork for thinking about what regional development along the West Coast might look like.
That role of identifying knowledge gaps and helping from a federal standpoint address those knowledge gaps, again, it's an effort to de-risk projects for folks on the West Coast. So, Carrie, California is absolutely driving West Coast offshore wind, and yet Oregon and Washington could play a role in both creating a larger future project pipeline and maybe more immediately supporting the domestic supply chain for offshore wind. And so I'm hoping today you can do a little bit of myth busting for us and clarify that this is not, the quantity and complexity of work needed to develop offshore wind on the West Coast is comparable to standing up our aerospace industries or our hydroelectric energy industry in the last decade. So in other words, competition among states is probably the last thing we need to worry about. In fact, what we really ought to be focused on is how do we muster as many resources to this as possible up and down the coast. So to that end, what is Washington doing right now to advance its role in the supply chain?
Great. Thank you, Ryan. And I would just echo, we completely are not thinking about this through a competition lens, but the pie is big enough for all of us. And so how can we cooperate with other states and find what our strategic place is in the supply chain? Again, I want to start with a little bit of context. And so Washington, we are much smaller than California, but we typically punch above our weight in clean energy manufacturing. We are the home of Boeing. We have a robust aerospace industry, robust manufacturing industry, and really hoping to parlay that into offshore wind supply chain as well. Under Governor Inslee's leadership, we have been really successful in transitioning into new clean energy spaces. I'm really thinking about sustainable aviation fuels, battery storage, and that's driven in large part because we have a really skilled and robust workforce that has been very supportive of this transition. And so we want to build on this momentum that we have in these other clean energy sectors by leveraging that into offshore wind supply chain. And we're really thinking about it in two different ways. The first one is strategic planning. So first, Washington has to have an idea of where we can fit into the puzzle. What are our comparative advantage for the skills that we have in our state, for the manufacturing that we already have in our state, and how can we make sure that we're plugging into that in a helpful way that's not going to be in direct competition with, an industry in Oregon. And we really achieve that through partnerships. And so that is both partnerships with the federal government and with our neighboring states, and then also looking internally. So we have some work going on in our state led by one of our maritime clusters, Maritime Blue, and they're leading an initiative called Blue Wind that is really working with stakeholders and tribes within our state to make sure that as we're thinking about engaging in the supply chain, we are bringing our communities along and we're making sure that communities, tribes, labor, everybody's actually benefiting in Washington from this engagement to support development that's going down in our south.
Yeah, this is a Three Musketeers type, not the candy bar, but the all for one and one for all kind of emphasis right now. William, much of our conversation on the West Coast has centered on building a supply chain for our own projects. I want to ask you, with your international perspective and the success of, as you said, a very small country in having this enormous role in the global wind energy economy, not just offshore, but onshore and offshore. Are we thinking too small? Is it possible that a West Coast supply chain could create an export market around the Pacific Rim and beyond? The answer is yes, and no. I'll let you answer.
It is. I think we've heard earlier today from other panelists that we definitely need to think big in this part of the world, in California. I think if you look at a map of the world and try to plot in where the supply chains are and where the manufacturing facilities are, West Coast is kind of isolated. I mean, there's, either you need to get something from Europe or you need to get something from Asia. So somehow it makes sense to build a supply chain on the West Coast. Because if you're looking at turbines, future-proof wind turbines, I mean, we're talking about, the turbines you can sign today is 15 megawatts, sorry. These are massive, massive units. I mean, if you've seen it live, it's like a 2-story villa on a stick, 500 feet up in the air. I mean, that's the kind of size we're talking about. And so shipping that around the world is super costly, by the way. And so it does make sense to consider a localized supply chain. But then again, to some of the points that were mentioned earlier, it doesn't need to be turbine manufacturing, it can be so many other things. There are a ton of different components that go into a turbine like that. But I just wanted to put that out there that, you know, a turbine is very, very bulky to transport, so somehow it makes sense to have it here. That's one thing. The other thing that's worthwhile considering when we're talking supply chain and all that stuff is, how do you make sure to future-proof it? The other data point that I noted down from an earlier session today was talking about, you know, ports and load capacities and stuff like that. There was a recent report issued in Denmark that pointed out that even the most advanced wind port in Denmark, Esbjerg port, is not future-proof for the coming 15 megawatt wind turbine. The load that it needs to be able to take is what is equivalent to 10,000 pounds per square foot. 10,000 pounds per square foot. That's the kind of load it needs to take. And that port is not ready for that. So there needs to be, you know, build out happening. And so I think when you're thinking about supply chain and facilities and stuff like that, you need to think 10, 15 years out into the future, really. And so are you thinking too small? I leave that to you to decide if it's too small, but I think it's worthwhile to look around the world and say, okay, where are we? Because there is capacity shortage. Europe needs to at least triple its capacity just to meet their own ambitions, right? And so you do the math.
Yeah, Carrie and I had an opportunity to visit Esbjerg last year, and if there is ever a place that will help you understand the scale of this industry, it is that port. It is both an enormous port and also just an extraordinarily well-run operation in order to serve all the wind needs in the North Sea and elsewhere. So
I just want to provide one more data point. And so that very same report that I referred to pointed out that a port area that's required to install a gigawatt a year is about 35 to 50 acres. That's the kind of port area that you need in order to facilitate the installation of 1 gigawatt per year. Well, just to give you a sense of size and magnitude.
This is a great segue to, you know, my heart's greatest interest, which is around ports. So, Jocelyn, we tend to focus on the stuff above the water when we're thinking about the supply chain development, the tip of the proverbial iceberg when it comes to offshore wind. In fact, the investments that we need to make in the earliest stages of this development of the supply chain are things that maybe don't come to mind first when you're thinking about it. It's the panel we heard before us, the transmission grid, the vessels, lots of R&D, but fundamentally ports. We keep hearing it over and over again, and the development timeline for ports is a decade. So we need to get started now if we aren't already. CAISO announced this last month a significant new investment in transmission. So we're excited to hear that on that particular potential choke point, there's real movement on the West Coast to address that concern. Do we need a similar type of commitment on the West Coast to the development of port infrastructure?
Yeah, good question. And I think that you are absolutely right that, and I think we have heard this a lot over the course of the last couple of days, port infrastructure development is going to be absolutely fundamental to our ability to develop offshore wind here on the West Coast. And when we think about developing, staging, and marshaling ports, we're talking about really land-intensive, space-intensive requirements. And so there is going to need to be, and I think we've heard lots of numbers bandied about over the course of the last couple of days in terms of the scale of investment that might be needed there. And we did include some estimates in that West Coast port study that I mentioned previously, so would point to folks to that study as a reference as well. So we are going to need an enormous investment in ports, and I think we've seen some promising steps in that direction with the Department of Transportation's recent award to Humboldt, and with planning efforts underway at multiple ports. But one of the things that I do want to emphasize when thinking about investments in ports is the economic opportunity that comes along with that investment. And I think you're hearing Will talk about kind of the evidence of that in Europe. And it's something that I think we're really starting to see on the East Coast of the United States. This combination of federal investment, state investment, and private investment really fueling what are not just staging and marshaling ports for offshore wind, but have the potential to then also serve as manufacturing hubs. And it's been really inspiring over the last couple weeks to see vessels launched, the opportunity for maritime revitalization through offshore wind. So I think one thing, we do need a significant investment in ports, but I do think we should think about it as exactly that. It's an investment that has the opportunity to bear fruit. And that's true for both staging and marshaling ports and O&M ports. And you mentioned a trip to Europe. I had a similar opportunity to visit Germany a couple years ago and had the opportunity to also see a port that's used for operations and service centers on a little island called Helgoland. And that was a really powerful example of how even the smaller ports, the operations and maintenance ports, can really be economic drivers for local communities. So this is a little island of just, I think, a couple thousand people, and the community had really come together through a dialogue about how they wanted offshore wind developed there. And then the introduction of the Operations and Service Center there really revitalized the economy of the island. The island went from losing money on an annual basis to having a thriving tourism industry, and was a really powerful example. So I think when we think about ports, I think we do need investment, but I also think that there's a real economic opportunity for us to realize. And we need to think about that economic opportunity from an environmental justice lens as well.
All right, Carrie, I've got one more question for you, which is about the kind of one of the unique attributes of the West Coast, which is that at this point, each state has set very aggressive climate goals, climate targets for themselves, and some enabling legislation that helps to meet those goals, which when it comes to offshore wind provides an extra opportunity or incentive to develop the supply chain here. Can you share with us some of the state programs in Washington that support that, and maybe their analogs in other states?
So I think in Washington we have really two cornerstones that have a touch point with offshore wind. The first is what's called CETO. This is our Clean Energy Transition Act, and this commits Washington State to 100% clean energy by 2045. And so that is really what is driving us towards aggressively pursuing clean energy sources and decarbonization. The second one is our Climate Commitment Act, and similar to California's Cap and Trade program, this is our state's Cap and Invest program that sets a limit on greenhouse gas emissions, and then requires that the greatest polluters in our state actually pay for their pollution, and the revenue generated from that program is then reinvested in Washington State to help our residents transition to a clean economy, to decarbonize, to do things like buy heat pumps and electric vehicles. And it is also funding some of our offshore wind studies. And so in the last 2 years of implementation, the Climate Commitment Act in our state has brought in over $3.2 billion into helping our state transition to the clean economy and make sure that our residents are protected from the worst impacts of climate change. And so I think it is really leveraging these two programs together, the investment side and then the incentive and really requirement towards decarbonization, that enables us to be engaged in this conversation, both from the supply chain perspective and the potential planning. What I want to highlight in this is just the importance of collaboration between both states and subnationals. And so Washington is really engaged both through the U.S. Climate Alliance and Pacific Coast Collaborative with Oregon, with California, and then with a lot of cities and other jurisdictions across to make sure that we have lessons learned, that we build enabling policy off of each other and create models that are replicable across the nation.
We've got a couple of questions up here. We're going to have to go a lightning round on, I think, just one of them. And so the first question is, what are opportunities on the West Coast to collaborate on science, monitoring, and conservation along the California current? And this recalls a conversation I had last night with our friends at Monterey Bay Aquarium about how, this need to collaborate across the coast because the fish don't stop swimming when they get to the Oregon border. So I don't know if anybody wants to take a shot at that.
I'm happy. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think to me it's twofold. First, it has to be driven by the research questions unique to the state. So we have to be using local knowledge of Washington tribes, Washington researchers, the fishing community that know the area best to inform what questions are at hand. And then absolutely it needs to leverage the research capabilities that we have across the state, across the West Coast, so that we're sure that we're, one, leveraging all our resources, and two, scoping the questions large enough so that we are looking at really the impact on a full range of species.
Excellent. Great way to wrap it up. And thank you, William. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Jocelyn. Let's give them a round of applause for great insights. All right.